Nestled between two rolling hills, the Watersports Club by Lake Darnell had an air of serene perfection. Its sapphire blue waters mirrored the clear skies above, a pristine image broken only by the gentle ripples of kayakers gliding across its surface. Families flocked to the shore during weekends, their laughter blending with the rustling of the pines that surrounded the lake. On the surface, the club was a haven of joy and recreation. Beneath its idyllic exterior, however, something darker lurked, unnoticed by the cheerful patrons who came for fun and sport. The club had been around for decades, established by the enigmatic Harold Thatcher. Harold had been a local hero of sorts, a man who turned the lake into a thriving hub for the community. Yet, whispers about Harold's eccentricities persisted long after his death. Locals spoke in hushed tones of the strange rituals he performed in the lake late at night, rituals that supposedly blessed the club with prosperity. Most dismissed these tales as folklore, a way to explain the club's uncanny ability to avoid financial hardship even in tough times. No one dared to probe deeper. For the regulars of the club, life was blissfully mundane. Ellie, the club's newest lifeguard, had just moved to the area and taken up the position as a way to escape her troubles. The lake's calm waters and friendly community seemed to promise a fresh start. She quickly befriended two of the older lifeguards, Nick and Clara, who had worked there for years. While Nick was carefree and charming, Clara carried a nervous energy, as though she knew more about the lake than she let on. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ellie found herself staring out at the water, mesmerized by how the lake's surface reflected the fiery hues of the setting sun. Clara joined her, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Ellie said, breaking the silence. "Yeah," Clara replied after a long pause. "But it's different at night. You'll see." Ellie chuckled nervously, unsure whether Clara was joking. Clara's tone suggested otherwise. Before Ellie could press her for more, Nick called out, waving a flashlight as he locked up the boathouse. "Come on, you two. Don't want to be out here after dark." That night, Ellie couldn't shake the strange conversation from her mind. Lying in her cabin on the edge of the club's property, she heard the faint sound of water lapping against the shore. It wasn't unusual given the lake's proximity, but there was a rhythm to it, almost like whispering. She sat up in bed, straining her ears, but the sound faded away as quickly as it had started. She brushed it off as her imagination, a trick of her tired mind, and went back to sleep. The next morning, Ellie arrived early for her shift. The lake was eerily still, its surface like glass. Nick and Clara were already there, preparing the rental equipment. Clara looked pale, her eyes darting nervously toward the water. "Did you hear about last night?" she asked Ellie in a low voice. "No," Ellie said, suddenly uneasy. "What happened?" "Some guy fishing near the south dock said he saw something, like a shadow under the water, big enough to tip his boat." Clara hesitated, lowering her voice even more. "He's been coming here for years and swears it wasn't a fish." Before Ellie could respond, a shout came from the docks. One of the patrons had overturned their kayak and was flailing in the water. Ellie and Nick sprang into action, diving in to pull the man to safety. As they hauled him back onto the dock, Ellie glanced down and froze. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something in the water, a dark, amorphous shape slipping beneath the surface. It was gone in an instant, leaving only the ripples from her own movement. Shaken but unsure of what she had seen, Ellie decided not to mention it. After all, it could have been her imagination, a trick of the light. But as the day wore on, she noticed more oddities. The club's usually bustling atmosphere felt subdued, as though an unseen force hung heavy over the lake. Even the regulars seemed more reserved, their laughter quieter, their smiles strained. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the whispering sounds outside her window. This time, they were unmistakable, like voices carried on the wind, speaking a language she couldn't understand. Gathering her courage, she crept outside, flashlight in hand. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the path to the lake. When she reached the shore, she froze. The water, usually so calm, was churning softly, as though disturbed by an unseen force. And then she saw it. Faint ripples forming a perfect circle in the center of the lake, growing wider and wider, as if something was rising from the depths. Ellie stepped back, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what she had just witnessed, but one thing was clear. Lake Darnell was hiding something. And whatever it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. The morning after Ellie's unsettling encounter at the lake, the air felt heavier, as though the world had woken up under a shroud. The usual cheer of the Watersports Club was muted, with fewer patrons than usual trickling in. Ellie arrived early, hoping daylight might erase the unease that had gripped her the night before. But as she stood by the dock, looking out at the lake, the memory of the circling ripples lingered. She wasn't imagining things. Something had been there. Clara joined her, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Rough night?" she asked, offering one to Ellie. Ellie hesitated before responding. "Yeah, I think I saw something last night. In the water." Clara stiffened, her smile faltering. "What did you see?" "I don't know," Ellie admitted. The lake looked alive almost. There were ripples like something big was moving just below the surface. But I couldn't see what it was. Clara didn't reply immediately. Instead, she stared at the lake, her face pale. "You're not the first person to say that," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "There's a reason some of us don't like being here after dark." Ellie's stomach tightened. She wanted to ask more, but before she could, Nick interrupted them, his boisterous voice cutting through the tension. "Ladies, we got a group of rowdy college kids coming in today. Let's not scare them off with ghost stories." He shot Clara a pointed look, clearly overhearing part of their conversation. Clara rolled her eyes and walked off, but Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that Nick's lighthearted dismissal masked something deeper. The group of college students arrived shortly after, their loud laughter and energy temporarily restoring some normalcy to the day. Ellie busied herself helping them with their kayaks and life jackets, trying to ignore the creeping unease that tugged at her whenever she glanced at the water. By noon, the lake seemed to have returned to its usual calm, the students paddling happily under the midday sun. But then, as the group moved farther from shore, Ellie noticed something unusual. One of the kayaks had stopped moving. Its occupant, a young man with a bright red life vest, was sitting perfectly still, staring down into the water. His friends called out to him, laughing and teasing, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. She grabbed a pair of binoculars from the dock and focused on the kayak. The young man's face was pale, his expression frozen in an unreadable mix of terror and fascination. Then, without warning, he tipped over, disappearing into the water. Ellie's instincts kicked in immediately. She grabbed a rescue board and dove into the lake, swimming as fast as she could. Nick followed close behind, shouting instructions to the remaining students to paddle back to shore. When Ellie reached the overturned kayak, she dove beneath it, searching for the young man. The water was cold and murky, visibility limited to just a few feet. As she swam deeper, her hand brushed something, an arm. She gripped it and pulled the man toward the surface. But as she did, she caught a glimpse of something else. A shadow, massive and amorphous, slid through the water below her. Her heart raced, and for a split second, she thought she saw eyes, dozens of them, glimmering faintly in the darkness. Ellie broke the surface, gasping for air as she hauled the unconscious man onto the rescue board. Nick helped her paddle him back to the dock, where Clara and the other lifeguards were waiting. The man coughed and sputtered as they laid him down, his chest rising and falling unevenly. "What happened out there?" Nick asked, his voice edged with concern. Ellie hesitated. I don't know. He just tipped over. Maybe he saw something." She stopped herself from mentioning the shadow. Nick already thought she was overreacting, and she wasn't in the mood to be dismissed again. The young man eventually regained consciousness, but refused to talk about what had happened. His friends joked nervously, trying to lighten the mood, but the tension was palpable. As the group packed up to leave, Ellie noticed the man glance back at the lake, his face ashen. That night, Ellie sat alone in her cabin, replaying the day's events in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the shadow she had seen, the eyes that seemed to watch her from the depths. Whatever was in the lake, it was real. And for the first time, she wondered if coming to Lake Darnell had been a mistake. From her window, she could see the lake glinting faintly under the moonlight. It looked peaceful, tranquil even, but Ellie knew better now. The calm was just a facade. Something was out there, waiting, and she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't done with her yet. The next morning, Ellie woke up with a gnawing sense of dread. Sleep had been elusive, her mind replaying the shadowy figure she'd glimpsed beneath the water. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess of questions, and she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't ignore what was happening at Lake Darnell. The lake was hiding something, and she had to figure out what. She arrived at the club earlier than usual, the morning mist still clinging to the surface of the water. Clara was already there, leaning against a picnic table and sipping coffee. Her tired eyes widened slightly when she saw Ellie. "Couldn't sleep either?" Clara asked, her voice tinged with understanding. Ellie shook her head. "I need to know what's going on here, Clara. The things I've seen, the ripples, the shadow, the eyes. I can't just pretend it's nothing." Clara's expression hardened, and she set her coffee down. "It's not nothing," she said quietly. "But people around here don't like to talk about it. Especially Nick. He acts like everything's fine, but he knows more than he lets on." Ellie leaned closer. "What do you mean? What does Nick know?" Clara hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "The lake isn't just a lake," she whispered. "There are stories, old ones, about Harold Thatcher, the guy who founded this place. They say he used to perform rituals out here, late at night. People in town thought he was some kind of occultist, but no one could prove it. Then one day he just disappeared." Ellie frowned, her curiosity growing. "Disappeared?" "Yeah," Clara continued. "No body, no goodbye, nothing. Just gone. Some people think he drowned, but others say he became part of the lake." Ellie shivered at the thought. The idea of someone becoming part of the lake felt like an ominous euphemism for something far darker. She decided she needed more than cryptic whispers. If she was going to understand what was happening, she needed concrete answers. Later that day, Ellie made her way into town. The small library, with its faded wooden sign and creaky floors, seemed like a good place to start. Inside, she was greeted by a friendly but reserved librarian named Mrs. Winslow. When Ellie asked about the lake's history, Mrs. Winslow's demeanor changed. "Lake Darnell, you say?" the older woman asked, her voice cautious. "Why the sudden interest?" "I work at the Water Sports Club," Ellie explained. "Some strange things have been happening, and I just want to learn more about the place." Mrs. Winslow gave her a long, scrutinizing look before motioning for Ellie to follow. She led her to a dusty corner of the library, where several old binders and newspapers were stacked. "These are the town archives," she said. "You might find what you're looking for here. But be careful, dear. Some things are better left alone." Ellie spent hours combing through the archives, piecing together the fragmented history of Lake Darnell. She found an article from 1964 about Harold Thatcher's disappearance. According to the piece, Thatcher had been last seen rowing out to the middle of the lake in the dead of night, carrying a lantern and something wrapped in a burlap sack. The next morning, his rowboat was found drifting near the shore, empty. Another article from the 1970s detailed a series of drownings at the lake, all under mysterious circumstances. Witnesses described seeing strange disturbances in the water before the victims vanished. The incidents were ruled accidental, but Ellie couldn't ignore the pattern. Then she found something chilling, a hand-drawn map of the lake from decades ago. Marked on it was a spot labeled The Abyss, located roughly in the center of the lake. Beside the label was a scribbled note, "Do not disturb." Ellie's heart raced as she stared at the map. The abyss had to be the area where she'd seen the strange ripples. Whatever was down there, it wasn't natural. She hurriedly copied the map into her notebook, her mind spinning with possibilities. As Ellie left the library, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. She clutched her notebook tightly, the weight of what she'd learned pressing down on her. The lake wasn't just a body of water. It was a repository of secrets, old and malevolent. Back at the club, Ellie found Clara waiting for her near the dock. "You're late," Clara said, her tone laced with concern. "Where were you?" "Research," Ellie replied, holding up her notebook. I think I know where we need to look. Clara's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. When she reached the copied map, she paled. You can't be serious, she whispered. You're not thinking of going out there? Are you? Ellie nodded, determination hardening her voice. I have to. Whatever's in this lake, it's not going to stop. And I'm not waiting for it to come to me. Clara hesitated, then sighed. If you're going, I'm going with you. Someone has to keep you from getting yourself killed. As the two women stared out at the darkening lake, its surface deceptively calm, Ellie felt a surge of both fear and resolve. The abyss was waiting, and they were going to find out exactly what lay beneath its depths. The morning air was crisp and unassuming as Ellie and Clara prepared their equipment. A sense of foreboding hung over them like the mist that clung to the lake's surface. Ellie had barely slept, her dreams plagued by rippling water and Harold Thatcher's shadowy figure rowing into the unknown. Clara, on the other hand, oscillated between grim determination and visible anxiety. Are you sure about this? Clara asked, tightening the straps of the life jacket over her wetsuit. Her tone carried a mix of apprehension and resignation. Ellie paused, staring out at the vast, glassy expanse of Lake Darnell. The water was deceptively serene, reflecting the clear blue sky like a perfect mirror. No, she admitted, but if we don't go, I'll never be able to live with myself. We have to know what's down there. Their small motorboat felt woefully inadequate for the task ahead. Loaded with a waterproof flashlight, underwater cameras, a sonar scanner, and a pair of diving suits, it looked more like a tourist rental than an expedition vessel. As the engines sputtered to life, the hum of the motor seemed unnaturally loud against the quiet backdrop of the lake. The journey to the center was unnerving. The deeper they went, the darker the water seemed to become, as if the lake itself were swallowing the daylight. Clara kept glancing over the edge, her knuckles white as she gripped the boat's railing. This place gives me the creeps, she muttered. It's too quiet. Ellie nodded in agreement. Even the usual sounds of birds and insects seemed to have vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. The only sound was the rhythmic splash of the water against the boat's hull. When they finally reached the spot marked the abyss on Ellie's map, the sonar scanner began to emit a series of sharp, irregular beeps. That's odd, Ellie said, frowning at the screen. The sonar displayed a jagged formation beneath them, much deeper than the surrounding lake bed. The formation seemed to pulsate faintly, as if the scanner were picking up a living, moving entity. Is that normal? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ellie shook her head. No, it's not. The two women donned their diving gear in tense silence. The air was thick with unspoken fears, but neither dared voice them. Ellie went first, slipping into the water with a muted splash. The cold enveloped her instantly, a shocking contrast to the warmth of the sunlit surface. Clara followed closely behind, her breathing loud and erratic through the regulator. As they descended, the water grew darker and colder, the light above fading into a murky blur. Ellie's flashlight beam sliced through the gloom, revealing a barren, lifeless expanse of silt and stone. But as they approached the area the sonar had marked, the scenery began to change. The lake bed was scarred with strange, jagged formations, towering spires of black rock that jutted out at unnatural angles. They looked ancient and out of place, as if they belonged to some otherworldly landscape. Ellie's flashlight caught faint carvings etched into the stone, resembling symbols or runes she couldn't decipher. Then she saw it. A massive crevice yawned before them, its edges lined with the same jagged rock formations. The abyssal blackness within seemed to pulse faintly, almost as if it were breathing. Ellie hovered at the edge, her heart pounding in her chest. She motioned for Clara to hold position while she aimed the underwater camera into the darkness. As the camera's light illuminated the crevice, Ellie's breath caught. Shapes began to emerge, organic, writhing shapes that defied explanation. Tendrils of some unknown material stretched and coiled, disappearing into the shadows. The longer she stared, the more her mind struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. It was as if the abyss itself were alive, a living entity that defied the laws of nature. Clara tapped Ellie's shoulder, her wide eyes communicating her unease. Ellie nodded, signaling that it was time to ascend. But as they turned to leave, a sudden movement caught Ellie's eye. One of the tendrils had shifted, curling upward toward the light of her flashlight. It was then that Ellie heard it, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the water, bypassing her ears and resonating directly in her chest. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a force that seemed to acknowledge their intrusion. Panic surged through Ellie as she grabbed Clara's arm and signaled for an emergency ascent. They kicked furiously toward the surface, the weight of the lake pressing down on them like an unseen hand. Ellie could feel the hum growing louder, more insistent, as if the abyss itself were reaching for them. When they finally broke the surface, gasping for air, the lake was eerily still. The motorboat bobbed gently nearby, its engine silent. They climbed aboard in a frantic rush, ripping off their masks and gulping in the fresh air. "What was that?" Clara gasped, her voice trembling. Ellie shook her head, staring out at the dark water. "I don't know," she said, "but it knows we're here." As they sped back to shore, the hum lingered in Ellie's mind, a haunting reminder that the lake had secrets it wasn't willing to give up easily. Ellie and Clara returned to the boathouse just as the sun began to set, painting the horizon in hues of gold and crimson. The once inviting scenery now felt oppressive, as if the lake were watching them leave. Ellie's hands trembled as she unloaded the equipment, her mind replaying the images she'd captured in the abyss. Clara was equally shaken, sitting on the dock with a towel draped over her shoulders, staring into the distance in silence. Inside the boathouse, Ellie reviewed the footage. Her laptop screen flickered as she replayed the dive. The camera's light swept across the jagged formations, and then the crevice came into view. Ellie froze the frame, zooming in on the writhing shapes within. Her breath caught as she realized they weren't just tendrils. They appeared to be alive, pulsating and stretching as if responding to the light. She paused the video, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. Clara entered the room, her face pale. "Did you see it?" she asked, her voice low. Ellie nodded, motioning for Clara to sit beside her. Together, they watched the footage again, this time slowing it down frame by frame. As they reached the part where the tendrils moved, the low hum they had heard underwater echoed faintly through the speakers. "That sound," Clara whispered, gripping Ellie's arm. "It's not just a sound, Ellie. It felt like it was inside me." Ellie didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the screen. In the final moments of the footage, just as the camera had turned away from the crevice, a shadowy figure appeared for a split second. It was humanoid, but distorted, its limbs too long, its movements unnervingly fluid. Ellie rewound and paused on the figure, her stomach churning. "What is that?" Clara asked, leaning closer. "I don't know," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "But it was down there with us." The discovery left them both rattled. Clara suggested they report their findings to the local authorities, but Ellie dismissed the idea. "What are we going to say? That we saw moving shadows and heard a sound underwater? They'll think we're crazy," she argued. Instead, Ellie proposed they gather more evidence before involving anyone else. Clara reluctantly agreed, though her unease was palpable. That night, Ellie struggled to sleep. She lay in her small cabin, listening to the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. The hum from the abyss seemed to linger in her ears, a ghostly echo that refused to fade. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were vivid and disjointed. She was back in the water, the darkness swallowing her whole. The shadowy figure reached out, its elongated fingers brushing against her arm. She awoke with a start, her chest heaving. Meanwhile, Clara stayed awake, pacing the shoreline. The events of the day replayed in her mind, each detail more unsettling than the last. As she stood by the edge of the lake, she noticed something strange. The water near the dock seemed to ripple, though there was no wind. A faint glow emanated from beneath the surface, pulsating in time with the hum that still haunted her. Ellie, she called out, panic rising in her voice. Ellie stumbled out of the cabin, groggy and disoriented. What is it? She asked, squinting at Clara. Clara pointed to the water. Look, do you see that? Ellie stepped closer, her eyes widening as she saw the glow. It was faint but undeniable, moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern. It's coming from the crevice, Ellie said, her voice barely audible. As they watched, the glow intensified, and the water began to churn violently. Both women stumbled back as a deep, guttural sound emerged from the lake, a sound that was not just heard but felt, vibrating through their very bones. The dock creaked under the strain of the rising waves, and the glow disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving the lake eerily calm. Ellie turned to Clara, her face pale. This isn't just a mystery anymore, she said. It's a warning. For the first time, Clara looked at Ellie with real fear in her eyes. We need to leave, she said firmly. But Ellie shook her head. Not yet, she replied. We're in too deep now. Whatever this is, we have to figure it out before it's too late. As the night deepened, the lake remained still, its surface reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of glass. But both women knew that beneath its calm exterior, something ancient and malevolent was stirring, and it had taken notice of them. The following morning broke with an unnatural stillness over the water sports club. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive silence that feels alive, pressing down on anyone who dared to disturb it. Ellie and Clara sat in the club's modest kitchen, nursing cups of coffee. Neither had slept well. Clara's hand trembled as she stirred her coffee, while Ellie scribbled notes furiously in her journal, her eyes bloodshot but determined. We need to go back out there, Ellie said abruptly, breaking the silence. Clara froze, the spoon clinking against her cup. Go back? Are you serious? Ellie, we barely made it out yesterday, and now the lake is glowing and roaring like something out of a horror movie. You can't seriously be thinking of diving again. I am, Ellie replied, her voice steady. Whatever's down there, it's not random. It's intelligent. It noticed us, and I need to know why. Her tone carried an edge of obsession, the kind that made Clara uneasy. She could see the same glint in Ellie's eyes that she'd seen the night Ellie first proposed the expedition, a hunger for answers that bordered on recklessness. Clara shook her head. No, you're playing with fire, Ellie. This isn't just some underwater cave system or a new species of algae. This is something else, something we don't understand. Ellie leaned forward, her expression intense. Exactly. And if we don't understand it, how can we stop it if it becomes a threat? We can't just ignore this. Before Clara could respond, the club's groundskeeper, an elderly man named Hank, entered the room. He was a grizzled figure with sun-weathered skin and a permanent squint, a fixture of the club for over 3 decades. Morning, ladies, he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. His tone was casual, but his sharp eyes quickly picked up on the tension in the room. You two look like you've seen a ghost, he said, leaning against the counter. Everything all right? Ellie hesitated, but decided to confide in him. She showed Hank the footage from the dive, explaining the events as concisely as she could. As he watched, his face grew grim. When the shadowy figure appeared on the screen, he let out a low whistle. I was hoping I'd never see anything like that again, he muttered under his breath. Ellie and Clara exchanged a glance. Again, Ellie asked, her voice tinged with urgency. What do you mean, Hank? Hank sighed, setting his mug down. Back in the 70s, before this place was a water sports club, it was a research station. Scientists came here to study the lake. Rumor was they were looking for something specific, something ancient. One day, they just packed up and left. No explanation. But not before half their team disappeared. Locals started saying the lake was cursed, that it didn't want to be disturbed. I didn't believe it back then, but now, he gestured toward the laptop. That thing you found? It's part of it. Clara's face turned pale. What are we dealing with, Hank? Hank shook his head. I don't know, but whatever it is, it's been here longer than any of us. Maybe longer than this lake. And it doesn't like being found. Ellie's determination faltered for the first time. You're saying we should leave it alone? I'm saying you're not prepared for what you're messing with, Hank replied. If I were you, I'd pack my bags and never look back. But Ellie couldn't let it go. The footage, the glowing water, the sounds. They were a puzzle she couldn't resist solving. She pressed Hank for more details, but he clammed up, muttering something about not tempting fate. Frustrated but undeterred, Ellie decided to continue her investigation, dragging Clara along despite her protests. That afternoon, Ellie took the boat out alone, armed with a camera and a waterproof microphone. Clara stayed behind, pacing the dock and chewing her nails as the boat shrank into the distance. Hours passed, and the oppressive stillness of the morning returned. The lake seemed to hold its breath, waiting. When Ellie finally returned, her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She climbed out of the boat without a word and walked past Clara, heading straight for her cabin. Clara followed, her heart pounding. "Ellie, what happened? Did you find something?" Ellie turned to face her, her hands shaking. "I didn't dive," she admitted. "I couldn't, but I lowered the mic into the water, and I heard something." "What?" Clara pressed. Ellie swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was humming, Clara, just like before. But this time it wasn't just noise. It was words. I swear to God, it was speaking to me." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "What did it say?" Ellie hesitated, then looked her friend dead in the eyes. "It said, 'Come back.'" The hum of the lake became an invisible weight, pressing down on Ellie and Clara as they stared at each other in the dim cabin. Clara's heart thudded in her chest, every nerve screaming at her to flee. But Ellie, her hands trembling and her breath shallow, seemed almost entranced by the memory of the voice that had spoken to her through the water. "Ellie, you're scaring me," Clara said, her voice cracking under the strain of her own rising panic. "You can't go back out there. Whatever this is, it's not just science, it's something else. It's dangerous." Ellie's gaze hardened. "If it's calling to me, I need to know why. Don't you get it, Clara? This isn't just a discovery, it's a phenomenon, a connection. We're standing on the edge of something the world hasn't seen before. That's exactly why we shouldn't mess with it." Clara shot back, her tone rising. "The last time people came looking for answers here, they vanished, Ellie. Do you want that to be us? Do you want your name to be a footnote in some creepy story about unexplained disappearances?" Ellie paced the room, the floor creaking under her feet. She couldn't deny the truth in Clara's words. Every instinct in her body told her to retreat, to leave this mystery in the dark where it belonged. But the pull of the unknown was too strong. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a compulsion. The lake had whispered to her, drawn her into its orbit, and the idea of leaving without answers felt like betrayal. After a tense silence, Ellie sighed. "Okay, fine. No more diving. No more going out alone. But we need more data. If the lake is trying to communicate, then we can record it, study it. We don't have to get too close." Clara nodded reluctantly, though doubt gnawed at her resolve. "Fine," she conceded. "But we do this safely. No risks, Ellie. Promise me." The next day, the two women set up a monitoring station on the dock. Ellie rigged the underwater microphone to a laptop, while Clara kept an eye on the water, her stomach churning with unease. The lake seemed unnaturally calm, its surface a glassy mirror that reflected the overcast sky. It was as if the lake itself were watching them. Hours passed with no activity. The microphone picked up only the faint ripple of water against the dock and the occasional distant splash of a fish. Clara began to relax, convincing herself that maybe the events of the past days had been exaggerated by their own fear and exhaustion. But then, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the laptop screen flickered. Ellie leaned forward, her eyes widening. "It's back," she whispered, her voice tinged with a mix of fear and excitement. Clara's stomach dropped. "What's back?" Ellie pointed to the audio waveform on the screen. "The hum. It's faint, but it's there." They both leaned in, listening intently. The sound began as a low vibration, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew louder, resonating through the speakers. It was the same eerie hum they had heard during their dive, but now it carried a rhythmic cadence, as though forming a melody. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Ellie frowned, adjusting the equipment, while Clara scanned the water, her pulse racing. She saw nothing unusual, just the still, dark surface of the lake. But then, out of the corner of her eye, Clara caught movement. A ripple broke the surface, followed by another, as though something massive was shifting just beneath. She grabbed Ellie's arm. "Ellie, look!" Ellie turned just in time to see the ripples vanish, leaving the lake as calm as ever. Her jaw clenched. "It's there," she said quietly. "It's watching us?" Clara shivered, her eyes darting around the water. "What do we do?" Ellie took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "We wait. If it's trying to communicate, it'll come back. We just have to be ready." As night fell, the hum returned, louder this time. It filled the air, vibrating through their bodies. Ellie's hands flew over the keyboard, recording every second, while Clara clutched a flashlight, her knuckles white. The hum grew until it became a roar, shaking the dock beneath their feet. The water glowed faintly, a pulsing light that seemed to echo the rhythm of the sound. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The glow faded, and the lake returned to its eerie stillness. Ellie slumped back in her chair, her face pale but triumphant. "We got it," she said, her voice shaking. "We recorded everything," but Clara wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the water, her breath shallow. "Ellie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." Ellie followed her gaze. At the edge of the dock, where the water lapped against the wood, a single handprint was pressed into the surface. It was wet, glistening faintly in the moonlight, and far too large to belong to any human. For the first time, Ellie's determination faltered. She stared at the handprint, her mind racing. The lake wasn't just communicating, it was reaching out. And now it had touched them. The wet handprint on the dock was a chilling marker of the unseen presence lurking within the lake. Clara and Ellie exchanged a glance that carried a silent, mutual understanding. They were no longer just observers. They had become participants in whatever mystery this place held. The glowing surface of the lake had dimmed into an unsettling calm, and the oppressive weight of the silence that followed felt heavier than any noise. That night, Clara insisted on locking the cabin windows and barricading the doors, her fear mounting with every passing hour. Ellie, though shaken, was more focused than ever. She pored over the audio recordings and visual data they captured, determined to piece together a coherent narrative. "If this thing is intelligent," she murmured to herself, "it has to follow some kind of logic." Clara sat across the room, clutching a mug of tea like a lifeline. "Logic?" she scoffed. "Ellie, there's a massive, wet something out there that just left its handprint on our dock. I don't think logic applies here anymore." Ellie didn't respond. Her focus was locked on the rhythmic patterns in the hum they'd recorded. She adjusted the playback, isolating specific tones and rearranging them in sequence. As the hours passed, a strange realization dawned on her. The sounds weren't random. They were forming what appeared to be a language. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. If the lake, or whatever was within it, was speaking, then it wasn't just aware of them, it was actively trying to engage. By the early hours of the morning, Ellie had managed to translate a fragment of the audio. Her makeshift analysis revealed something hauntingly simple, yet unnerving. The words "come closer" repeated in the rhythmic hum. She stared at the screen in disbelief. The message felt both an invitation and a warning. Clara, half asleep on the couch, jolted awake when Ellie whispered, "It's talking to us." Clara's eyes widened, and she shook her head vehemently. "No, Ellie, no. This is exactly how every horror story goes wrong. You're not going out there again." Ellie hesitated. The scientist in her was desperate to answer the call, to confront the unknown and decode its mysteries. But a primal instinct, one she rarely acknowledged, screamed for her to stay far away. Still, the allure of discovery was overwhelming. "We can't just ignore this," she argued. "This is unprecedented. If it's trying to communicate, we have to respond." Clara stood, her voice rising with panic. "Respond? Are you listening to yourself?" "Ellie, this isn't a science experiment. It's something else, something we don't understand. And the last thing we should do is go closer. It's dangerous." Their argument was interrupted by a loud thud against the cabin wall. Both women froze. Clara's mug slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. They stared at each other, their breath caught in their throats. The sound came again, heavier this time, like a massive object striking the wood. Ellie grabbed a flashlight while Clara held a fireplace poker like a weapon. Slowly, they crept toward the window. Ellie lifted the curtain, her hands trembling. What they saw made her drop the flashlight in shock. Standing at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure. It was tall, inhumanly so, and its elongated limbs swayed unnaturally, as though moved by an unseen current. The figure didn't approach, but stood still, watching them. Its head tilted, and though its face was shrouded in darkness, Ellie felt the weight of its gaze. She could almost swear it was smiling, though she couldn't see its mouth. "Get away from the window," Clara hissed, pulling Ellie back. "Don't let it see you." Ellie's voice was barely a whisper. "I think it already has." The figure didn't move, but the oppressive silence that surrounded it felt deafening. The two women crouched in the middle of the cabin, their minds racing. What did it want? Why had it revealed itself now? And most importantly, how long had it been watching? As the hours dragged on, the figure eventually disappeared into the shadows, leaving the two women shaken but unharmed. Clara wanted to leave immediately, but Ellie insisted they couldn't abandon their research. Not yet. "Whatever's out there," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes, "it's not finished with us." That night, as the lake shimmered faintly under the moonlight, the hum began again. This time, it was louder, deeper, and laced with an undercurrent of urgency. Ellie and Clara didn't sleep, haunted by the knowledge that something far beyond their understanding had begun to unfold, and they were at its center. The following morning arrived cloaked in mist, casting the lake in a surreal, dreamlike haze. Ellie and Clara sat across from each other at the small wooden table in the cabin, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Neither had slept, too haunted by the events of the night. Clara's coffee sat untouched, its steam swirling in the cold air, while Ellie leafed through her research notebook in a frantic attempt to make sense of the chaos. "It's not random," Ellie said, breaking the silence. Her voice was hoarse from a night of whispered debates. "The figure, the hum, the handprint, it's all connected. I just need to figure out how." Clara slammed her hand on the table, making Ellie flinch. "You don't need to figure anything out," she snapped. "We need to leave, Ellie. Whatever's out there isn't trying to communicate, it's trying to lure us in. And if we stay, we're going to end up like those missing people." The words hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder of the club's eerie history. Ellie bit her lip, unwilling to admit that Clara might be right. But just as she was about to respond, something caught her eye, a glint of silver protruding from beneath the cabin's rickety bookshelf. Frowning, she got up and crouched down to investigate. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, her irritation giving way to curiosity. Ellie didn't answer immediately. She pulled the object free, brushing away years of dust to reveal an old, weathered photograph encased in a tarnished silver frame. The image showed a group of people standing on the dock, their faces frozen in smiles. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, a typical summer snapshot. But as Ellie examined it closer, her stomach twisted. The group in the photo was standing on the very same dock where she and Clara had recorded the strange hum. But what truly unnerved her was the figure in the background, a tall, shadowy silhouette standing at the edge of the tree line, almost identical to the one they had seen the previous night. Clara leaned over Ellie's shoulder, her breath hitching when she saw the figure. "Is that?" she began, but she couldn't finish the question. The realization was too horrifying. "It's the same," Ellie whispered. "It's been here before." Watching, the discovery sent a fresh wave of fear through both women. Ellie flipped the frame over, hoping for a clue, and found a date scrawled in fading ink. July 1983. Beneath it, a single name, Hargrove Expedition. "What is the Hargrove Expedition?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Ellie stood up abruptly, her mind racing. "I don't know, but if they were here in 1983, that's more than 30 years ago." And judging by this photo, she trailed off, staring at the smiling faces. Something happened to them. The next few hours were a blur of frantic research. Ellie combed through every record she could find in the club's tiny library and archives. Old guest logs, faded newsletters, and even maintenance reports offered fragments of a larger story. She eventually pieced together the tale of the Hargrove expedition, a group of amateur scientists and nature enthusiasts who had come to study the unique acoustics of the lake. They had been fascinated by the same hum that Ellie and Clara had recorded. But the records ended abruptly. No official report of their findings, no news of their departure, just silence. It was as if the group had simply vanished. Ellie's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a pattern. Clara was pacing the cabin, gripping the fireplace poker like a lifeline. Ellie, we're not going to solve a 30-year-old mystery. If these people disappeared, so can we. I'm serious. We need to leave. Ellie hesitated, torn between her fear and her insatiable curiosity. But what if we're the only ones who can figure this out? She argued. What if we can stop it? Clara turned to her, her eyes blazing with frustration. Stop what, Ellie? We don't even know what it is. You think this is about science, but it's not. This thing, whatever it is, doesn't play by the rules you're used to. Before Ellie could respond, a strange sound interrupted them. A faint, rhythmic tapping against the cabin window. Both women froze, their eyes darting toward the source. The mist outside had thickened, obscuring the view. But as the tapping grew louder, Ellie swore she could make out a shape moving just beyond the glass. It wasn't human. Ellie, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Please, let's go. The tapping stopped abruptly, plunging the cabin into an eerie silence. Ellie's heart thundered in her chest as she stared at the window, half expecting the figure from the photograph to appear. But the glass remained fogged and opaque, hiding whatever was outside. For the first time, Ellie felt the full weight of Clara's words. This wasn't about logic or discovery. It was about survival. And suddenly, leaving didn't seem like such a bad idea. The air in the cabin felt thicker, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Clara's words echoed in Ellie's mind, each repetition of "let's go" pushing her closer to a decision she'd been avoiding. The hum from the lake still lingered in the background, a constant reminder of the presence that had been watching them. It was as if the place itself were alive, breathing in unison with their anxiety. Ellie stared at the fogged window, feeling the weight of Clara's gaze behind her. What do we do? Ellie finally asked, her voice shaky but firm. The constant dread gnawed at her, urging her to flee, yet a part of her resisted. The scientist inside her couldn't abandon the mystery. But the deeper, more primal part of her, the part that had been listening to Clara's fears, knew that the risks had escalated beyond comprehension. Clara stood by the door, her face pale but determined. We pack up and leave. Now. No more waiting for answers. This place is cursed, Ellie. That thing outside is not just watching us. It wants something. Ellie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Clara's words sink into her bones. Was it possible that Clara was right? The lake, the strange figure, the hum, it all felt interconnected, like a web that was pulling them closer to some inevitable fate. She wanted to resist, to keep searching for answers, but something deep inside urged her to listen to Clara's plea. She shook her head. I can't just walk away. This could be the discovery of a lifetime. Do you understand that? We've recorded something no one has ever heard before. The Hargrove expedition, they vanished for a reason, and I think we can figure out what happened to them. Clara's eyes softened for a moment, but her resolve didn't waver. Ellie, I get it. I know you're obsessed with finding answers, but there's more at stake here than just science. This thing, whatever it is, it's dangerous. I don't care if it's an ancient creature or a twisted force of nature. It's not worth gambling our lives over. Ellie looked down at the photograph of the Hargrove expedition, now lying on the table beside her. The smiling faces, the promises of a scientific breakthrough, all seemed so naive now. Were they just as curious? Did they make the same mistake, thinking they could control whatever was out there? She picked up the photo, her thumb tracing the edges of the frame. The image of the shadowy figure stood stark against the background of smiling faces, an ominous premonition frozen in time. The hum, the figure, the vanishing, it all pointed to something dark. But was it a mystery worth solving? Or was it a warning? Suddenly, the sound of a distant splash broke her reverie. It was sharp, cutting through the silence of the cabin like a knife. Both women froze. The sound came again, this time louder, closer. It wasn't the sound of a boat or something natural. It was something far more deliberate. The faint splashing continued, rhythmic and heavy, as though something large was moving beneath the water's surface, just out of sight. Clara grabbed Ellie's arm, pulling her toward the door. "We're leaving now," she said, her voice trembling. Ellie's heart raced in her chest as she stumbled to her feet. The once peaceful lake now seemed like a threat, the water churning with hidden malevolence. But as they reached the door, a sharp crack echoed from outside. The air shifted again, and the mist surrounding the cabin seemed to intensify, closing in as though the land itself was pressing against them. Ellie hesitated, torn between fleeing and one last attempt to understand the source of their torment. "I know you're scared," Ellie said, her voice low and almost apologetic. "But we've come so far. Don't you want to know what's really happening here?" Clara's gaze softened for a moment, but then her expression hardened. "I want to be alive, Ellie. I want to live, and I don't think we'll do that if we stay here." Ellie's stomach twisted as she looked back at the lake. The mist had thickened, and the dark water reflected the murky sky in unsettling waves. Was this place really alive, as Clara had suggested? Was it really pulling them in with an invisible force? Or was it their own fear making the danger feel much worse? The rhythmic splashing grew louder, almost deafening. Something was getting closer. The same sensation Ellie had felt the night before. The presence of something watching, waiting, began to suffocate her. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was as if the very air around them was charged with something unnatural, like a storm about to break. Finally, Ellie made her decision. She turned to Clara and nodded. "You're right," she said, her voice weak but resolute. "We leave. We get out now." Clara gave a small sigh of relief, her shoulders relaxing slightly. They hurriedly packed their belongings, no longer concerned with preserving their research or the records they had gathered. The only goal was to leave the cabin and the suffocating presence behind. It took only a few minutes to grab the essentials, and before long, they were heading out into the mist. The path to the dock felt endless, the fog blurring everything beyond a few feet. Ellie's pulse quickened with every step, each sound from the lake, a distant splash, a ripple in the water, making her heart race. As they reached the boat, the overwhelming silence settled between them. They climbed in, and without a word, Clara started the engine, pushing them away from the shore. The boat crept forward, slowly cutting through the mist, the oppressive weight of the unknown still looming over them. Ellie's eyes darted to the dark water, watching for any signs of movement, any trace of the thing they had encountered. But the lake remained still, its secrets locked beneath the surface. As the cabin and its eerie presence shrank behind them, Ellie let out a slow breath, but it didn't bring relief. She was leaving the lake, but not its haunting pull. The mystery wasn't solved. The danger hadn't passed. It was just waiting for them to return. The hum of the boat's engine was the only sound that could cut through the suffocating silence. Ellie sat at the bow, her hands gripping the cold metal railing, while Clara steered them away from the mist-covered lake. The sense of urgency in Clara's movements was palpable, her knuckles white against the wheel, her eyes darting back and forth between the water ahead and the thick fog slowly swallowing the shoreline behind them. The boat cut through the dark water, but Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something was trailing them, just beneath the surface, hidden in the depths. The further they moved from the cabin, the less the tension seemed to ease. Clara had said that leaving was the only option, that there was nothing more they could do here. But Ellie couldn't shake the thought that they had just fled from something they hadn't fully understood. It didn't feel like escape. It felt like running from a truth they weren't ready to face. They had come to the lake for answers, and yet all they had found was fear, a fear that clung to them even as the boat sped further away from the shore. As the boat slowly picked up speed, Ellie glanced back one last time. The fog now seemed to cover the entire area where the cabin once stood, as if it had been absorbed into the mist itself, leaving no trace of its existence. It was unsettling, the way the lake seemed to erase the evidence of their time there, as though it had never happened. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary place. It was as though the lake had consumed the past, had absorbed their experiences and memories into its dark, endless waters. Her eyes lingered on the shifting fog, and a strange thought crossed her mind. What if the lake had never wanted them to leave? What if it had been calling them, drawing them in all along? The hum, the whisper she had heard, that strange vibration in the air. Was it trying to communicate with them? Or was it merely an illusion, a product of their own minds? Ellie couldn't tell, but the nagging sense of unfinished business clung to her, the questions gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. Suddenly, Clara's voice broke through the silence, shaking Ellie from her reverie. "We need to call the authorities when we get to the nearest town," Clara said, her voice low but firm. "They need to know what's been going on here." Ellie hesitated. The authorities? What could they possibly say? How could they explain what had happened without sounding like lunatics? The oddities of the lake, the strange disappearances, the figure in the mist. It was too much for anyone to believe. Clara might have been right, but Ellie wasn't sure they could trust anyone else with the truth. "Do you really think anyone will believe us?" Ellie asked quietly. "How do we even explain what we saw? The sounds, the figure, everything? It doesn't make sense, Clara. If we tell them, they'll think we're just two paranoid scientists." Clara's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but her gaze remained steady. "I don't care if they believe us. What matters is that we make sure no one else ends up like the Hargrove expedition. If there's a chance, just a chance, that they went through the same thing, we have to warn people." Ellie stared at the water, watching as the ripples spread out from the boat's wake. Clara was right in one regard. There was no going back. They had witnessed something, and whether or not the world understood it, they couldn't ignore the responsibility that came with knowing the truth. Or at least part of it. What had really happened to the Hargrove team? Were they the same as the others who had vanished in the past? Or was this something entirely new? These were the questions that lingered in Ellie's mind, questions that no one could answer unless they returned. But Clara's words had struck a chord. Warning others, the idea felt like the right thing to do, even if it seemed insane. How could they live with the knowledge and not act on it? But even as Ellie considered the possibility of involving authorities, she felt the same unease that had been with her since the moment they left the cabin. She didn't trust anyone. Not yet. The boat continued forward, the distance between them and the lake's eerie stillness increasing with every passing second. But as they approached the outskirts of the town, something unexpected happened. The radio, which had been silent throughout their journey, flickered to life. A low static hum filled the air, but beneath it, a voice began to emerge, faint but unmistakable. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as she leaned toward the receiver, her fingers instinctively reaching for the dial. The voice was distant, crackling as if coming from far away, but it was clear enough to hear. "Do not return. They are watching." The words sent a chill through her body. Clara, noticing her reaction, looked over. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tense. Ellie, still staring at the radio in disbelief, didn't answer immediately. The voice was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the static behind. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to dismiss it, to convince herself it was just some interference, some malfunction. But deep down, Ellie knew better. The voice had been too deliberate, too clear to ignore. Clara noticed the expression on Ellie's face and frowned. What happened? Who was that? Ellie shook her head, still stunned. "I don't know, but it wasn't just static. It was a message. Someone or something doesn't want us to go back." Clara's face grew pale. The silence that followed was thick with dread, each moment stretching into eternity as the weight of the voice's warning settled over them. There was no turning back now. The question wasn't whether they should go to the authorities. It was whether they were even safe in the town anymore. What if the warning was more than just a threat? What if it was a promise of something far worse waiting for them? The town's silhouette finally emerged from the mist, a vague outline of houses and buildings that appeared to be no more than shadows against the gray sky. It had been hours since they first left the lake behind, but the unsettling voice on the radio still echoed in Ellie's mind. It was as if the message had crawled into her thoughts, lingering like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. As the boat neared the dock, she couldn't shake the feeling that their escape wasn't truly an escape at all. Clara brought the boat to a gentle halt by the dock, her hands shaky as she cut the engine. The town loomed ahead like a quiet, unsuspecting world, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded just beyond its borders. The boat swayed slightly in the still water, as though even it could sense the unease that had taken root in Ellie's chest. There was something wrong here, something about the town itself that felt off. As they climbed out and onto the dock, the quiet seemed to suffocate them. No birds called from the trees. No cars passed down the narrow streets. The stillness was unnerving, and Ellie could feel the weight of it pressing against her. Clara seemed to notice the atmosphere too. She stepped lightly off the boat, glancing around as if waiting for something to break the silence. "Let's get to the authorities. Maybe they know something," she said, trying to sound resolute but not entirely convincing. Ellie nodded but didn't respond. She didn't trust the town, not after everything they'd seen. If the voice on the radio was real, then it wasn't just the lake they had to worry about. It was the town too. As they walked through the main street, a strange sensation washed over Ellie. The buildings seemed too quiet, their windows empty and dark, as though they were waiting for something. It wasn't that the town was abandoned. It wasn't. But there was a profound sense of absence. It was as though life itself had been suspended here, like something invisible had stilled the pulse of the place. They passed a few shops with faded signs, but no one was outside. No one came to greet them. No one seemed to notice them at all. Ellie glanced over at Clara, who had become increasingly tense, her eyes darting from one side of the street to the other. They were the only ones walking here, and that felt wrong. There was no sound of children playing, no laughter, no conversations spilling from the open doors of the town's homes. It felt as though the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was an eerie stillness, one that Ellie couldn't shake, and she felt a deep, unsettling fear take root in her stomach. The town square loomed ahead, and for a moment, Ellie thought she saw a figure standing in the distance. The figure was tall, thin, and motionless, just at the edge of a small park. Ellie froze, her heart pounding. She couldn't tell if it was a person or just another illusion of the fog, but something about it felt wrong. As she took a step forward, the figure seemed to vanish, disappearing into the mist as though it had never been there at all. She blinked and looked again, but it was gone. "Did you see that?" Ellie whispered, turning to Clara. Clara didn't answer immediately, her gaze searching the square, the streets, but her expression was unreadable. "It's just the fog," she said, her voice more strained than usual. "We're just tired, Ellie. We need to focus. Let's get to the sheriff's office." The sheriff's office was on the corner of the square, a small building with a faded blue sign above the door. It was almost comically mundane, especially in the wake of everything they had seen at the lake. Ellie couldn't help but feel that the most ordinary place was the one that would hold the answers they so desperately needed. They approached the door and stepped inside. Inside, the sheriff's office was cramped, with old wooden desks lined against the walls. A faded American flag hung in one corner, its colors worn by time. The sheriff, a gruff man in his mid-50s with a graying beard, was sitting at his desk, flipping through paperwork. He didn't look up as they entered, his focus solely on the documents in front of him. There was a heavy smell of coffee in the air, mixed with the faint scent of stale paper and old leather. Clara cleared her throat, and the sheriff finally looked up, his expression flat and disinterested. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice dry and unwelcoming. "We need to report something," Clara said, her voice firm but edged with uncertainty. "Something strange is happening in the area, and we think it's connected to the lake." The sheriff interrupted her with a raised hand. "I've heard all about the lake. Nothing new happens there." His voice was dismissive, and he turned back to his papers. "I don't have time for wild stories about the lake. You're not the first to come here talking about it, and you won't be the last." Ellie felt her frustration building, but she tried to remain calm. "You don't understand," she said, stepping closer to the desk. "People have gone missing. Strange things are happening, and—" I said, the sheriff barked, finally lifting his gaze and locking eyes with her. "Nothing new happens at that lake. Now, if you're done, I suggest you leave." His tone was final, and there was something in his eyes that made Ellie's skin crawl. It wasn't just indifference. It was a knowing, a cold detachment that unsettled her more than anything else. Clara opened her mouth to protest, but Ellie pulled her back, her mind racing. The sheriff was hiding something. She could feel it. He knew more than he was letting on, and that only deepened the sense of danger that had been creeping up on them ever since they arrived. What was it that he didn't want them to know? And why had he reacted so strongly? As they left the sheriff's office, Ellie's mind whirled. This wasn't just about the lake anymore. It was about the town, about the people here. Something had happened, something they weren't being told, and it was connected to the horrors of the water. The figure she had seen earlier, the sheriff's strange behavior, the stillness of the town. It was all part of something much bigger, something far more terrifying. Ellie felt a cold shiver run down her spine. It was only just beginning. They had stumbled onto something far more sinister than either of them could have imagined. And now, there was no turning back. The town's growing unease weighed heavily on Ellie's shoulders as they walked away from the sheriff's office. The streets, which had felt eerily silent before, now felt suffocating, as if the very air was thick with the secrets that lurked beneath the surface. The sheriff's dismissiveness had only added to her growing suspicion. There was something wrong in this town, something far darker than anyone had been willing to admit. She glanced over at Clara, who had remained silent since they left the office. Her expression was one of grim contemplation, but there was also a hint of worry in her eyes. "Clara, what if the sheriff's not telling us the truth?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man knew far more than he was letting on. Clara hesitated, her gaze shifting toward the ground. "I don't know, Ellie," she said softly, "but there's something about him that doesn't sit right with me either. It's like he's trying too hard to dismiss us, to make us go away." Ellie nodded. She felt the same way. It was as if the sheriff knew exactly what they were investigating, but was actively working to keep them in the dark. The longer they stayed, the more certain Ellie became that the town was hiding something, a secret far more sinister than they had ever imagined. As they continued walking, Ellie felt the weight of the town closing in on them. It wasn't just the silence or the unsettling calm. It was the sense that they were being watched. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if every building, every shadow, and every street corner had eyes, and those eyes were following their every move. It wasn't paranoia. It was real, and it made Ellie's skin crawl. "Do you feel that?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Like we're being watched?" Clara's face tightened with unease. "Yes," she said, her tone low. "I felt it too, like there's something just out of sight, something we can't see, but it's always there, just beyond the corner of our eyes." The feeling grew stronger as they made their way deeper into the heart of the town. The houses seemed to loom over them now, their windows like dark, hollow eyes that glared down at them from the shadows. It was as though the buildings themselves were watching, waiting for something to happen. Ellie tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, gnawing at her with every step they took. They eventually arrived at a small cafe on the edge of the square. It was the only place that seemed remotely alive. There were people inside, and the faint sound of clinking coffee cups and low chatter spilled out from the open door. Ellie and Clara exchanged a look, both silently agreeing that they needed a break. They stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing softly as they entered. The cafe was small but cozy, with mismatched chairs and a few tables scattered across the room. The air smelled faintly of coffee and pastries, but the atmosphere was strangely subdued. The patrons, a mix of older men and women, sat in silence, their faces tired and worn. No one looked up when Ellie and Clara entered, as though they were all too used to strangers passing through, too used to the emptiness that seemed to hang over the town. They took a seat by the window, the faintest sense of relief washing over them as they settled into the quiet. But even here, there was something unsettling. The silence in the cafe felt oppressive, the way the eyes of the other patrons seemed to linger just a little too long, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Ellie tried to ignore the feeling, focusing instead on the warmth of the coffee the waitress placed in front of them. It was the first real warmth she had felt in hours. Clara, however, was restless. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes darting to the people at the other tables, her body tense, as if she was ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Ellie noticed her unease and leaned in, lowering her voice. "What's going on, Clara? You've been on edge ever since we got here." Clara took a long sip of her coffee, then set the cup down with a soft clink. "I don't know," she confessed, her voice tight. "It's just this town. These people. They all seem so normal, but there's something about them that feels off. Like they're all hiding something, but none of them want to talk about it. It's like they're all playing a part in something, and we're just not supposed to know." Ellie looked around the cafe again, her unease growing. Clara's words echoed in her mind. It was true. The people in the cafe didn't seem to be talking to each other. They just sat in silence, each in their own little world, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. They all seemed to be waiting for something just beyond their control. As they finished their coffee, Ellie noticed something strange. The door to the cafe opened, and a man stepped inside, a tall, thin figure with a hood pulled over his head. His face was obscured in shadow, but there was something about the way he moved that caught Ellie's attention. He walked slowly, deliberately, and as he passed their table, Ellie could have sworn he looked directly at her, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. There was no mistaking it, his eyes were not human. The pale glow was unnatural, like something from a nightmare. He didn't stop, didn't say anything. He just continued toward the back of the cafe, where a door led to a hallway. But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching her, that he knew something she didn't. Clara looked at her, her expression puzzled. "Ellie, what's wrong?" Ellie opened her mouth to speak, but found that she couldn't. The words were stuck in her throat. She had seen it. She was sure of it. The man was one of them, one of the Watchers, the ones who had been following them ever since they stepped into this town. He was connected to the horrors that had plagued the lake. And now he was here in the cafe, watching them just like the rest of them. "Clara," Ellie whispered, her voice shaking. "We have to leave. Now." Clara didn't ask questions. She stood immediately, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. They made their way to the door quickly, trying to blend in with the other patrons. But as they stepped outside, Ellie felt the eyes on them again. Eyes that weren't just in the cafe, but everywhere, hidden in the shadows of the town, waiting for the right moment to strike. And in that moment, Ellie knew that they had made a grave mistake. They weren't just being watched, they were being hunted. The walk back to their cabin was a quiet one. Ellie's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the man she had seen in the cafe. His eyes, glowing with that unnatural light, haunted her thoughts, each moment replaying in her mind with more clarity. She had tried to tell herself that it was just a trick of the light, an illusion created by the shadows in the dim cafe. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The man wasn't just a stranger. He was part of something far darker, something woven into the very fabric of the town's past. Ellie could feel the weight of that history pressing down on her shoulders with each step she took. Clara, though silent, walked beside her with a heightened awareness. Ellie could feel her friend's unease growing with every passing minute. It was as if they were both aware of the inevitable confrontation looming on the horizon. The strange man, the unsettling eyes. These were not isolated incidents. Something about this town was wrong, and the more they uncovered, the deeper they seemed to fall into a web of twisted secrets that no one wanted to speak of. When they reached the cabin, Clara immediately moved toward the table, her hands shaking as she reached for the map they had been using to track their investigation. Ellie watched her for a moment before speaking. "Clara, we need to figure out what's really going on here," Ellie said, her voice firm, though she couldn't entirely mask the fear creeping into her words. "We've been chasing shadows, but I don't think it's just the lake that's haunted. I think the whole town is." Clara didn't look up from the map, but nodded slowly. "I agree," she said, her tone distant. "There's something about the history of this place, something people are afraid to talk about. But we're not going to find any answers if we don't start digging deeper into what happened here. A long time ago, Ellie sat down across from Clara, her mind racing with possibilities. She had read about small towns with dark secrets before, places where the weight of history was so suffocating that it warped the very people who lived there. But this town, this place, felt different. There was an oppressive heaviness to it, a sense that something ancient was stirring beneath the surface, something that had been dormant for decades, but was now slowly awakening. "Do you think the lake is connected to the town's past?" Ellie asked, her voice quieter now, almost as though she feared the answer. Clara finally looked up, her eyes narrowing in thought. "I think it's more than just a body of water," she said slowly. "There's a reason people avoid it, why they keep their distance. They know something we don't, and whatever it is, it's tied to the town's history. To the people who live here." Ellie leaned back in her chair, staring at the map in front of them. There were small notations on the lake, hints of things hidden away in the folds of the paper, places marked with an X, areas along the shore where there had been strange disappearances over the years. But none of that explained the man with the glowing eyes, or the way the people in the cafe seemed to be waiting for something. What were they all hiding? "Maybe we should go to the town archives," Ellie suggested after a long pause. "We need to understand the history of this place, the stories people have forgotten or buried. If we can get access to old records, maybe we'll find something that connects the lake, the people, and whatever is going on here." Clara hesitated for a moment, clearly torn. The idea of uncovering more, of unearthing even darker truths, made her uneasy. But there was a fire in Ellie's eyes, a determination that Clara couldn't ignore. "I don't know if that's a good idea," Clara muttered, glancing nervously toward the window. "But you're right. The more we know, the better we'll be prepared for whatever we're up against." As they discussed their plan, a heavy silence settled over the cabin, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. The air seemed to grow thick with tension, as if the very walls were listening to their every word. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched again. Her instincts were screaming at her, warning her to leave, to stop this investigation before it was too late. But it was too late to turn back now. The pull of the town's mystery was too strong. They had come too far to walk away without answers. The next morning, Ellie and Clara headed into town early. The streets were quieter than usual, but the air felt charged, like a storm was brewing just out of sight. As they made their way to the town hall, they passed familiar faces, locals who glanced at them with suspicion, their eyes darting away quickly whenever they were caught staring. It was as if the town itself was rejecting them, warning them not to dig too deep. Inside the town hall, they found the archives office tucked away in the back, an unassuming room filled with dusty shelves and old records. The woman behind the desk, a stiff and unwelcoming figure, barely acknowledged them as they entered. She looked up at them briefly, her eyes narrowing in judgment before she spoke in a monotone voice. "You want to look at old records, huh?" she asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. "Why?" Ellie was taken aback for a moment, but then steeled herself. "We're just researching the town's history. We're looking for any information on the lake, the disappearances, anything that could explain what's been happening lately." The woman's eyes flickered for a moment, just a moment. But in that fleeting instant, Ellie saw it, fear. The woman quickly masked it with a forced smile, but it was too late. Ellie had seen the truth. The woman knew more than she was letting on. "Fine," the woman said, her tone now colder than before. "But I wouldn't go looking for things that aren't meant to be found." Clara glanced at Ellie, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. But they had no choice. The door to the past had opened, and they had no intention of turning back now. As the woman led them to a large filing cabinet, Ellie could sense that they were close to uncovering something monumental. She didn't know what it would be, but she knew it was going to change everything. The more they uncovered, the closer they got to the terrifying truth about the town, the lake, and the horrors that had been buried in the past. But even as they pulled out the first set of old, yellowed files, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something far worse than they could ever imagine. And deep down, she feared that the town would never let them leave once they knew the truth. The morning that followed their visit to the archives was unnervingly still, as though the town itself was holding its breath. Ellie and Clara had not spoken much as they walked back to their cabin, each of them trying to process what they had uncovered. The old records in the town archives had been more than just history. They had been a warning. The documents, though cryptic and fragmented, spoke of strange occurrences tied to the lake, of people who had vanished without a trace, and of a shadowy figure that seemed to haunt the town through the generations. The more they read, the clearer it became that the town was cursed, bound to a dark force far older than any of them. The first file they had uncovered had belonged to an investigation from decades ago, when several people in the town had gone missing after visiting the lake. The authorities had dismissed it as a series of unfortunate accidents, but the record spoke of something far more sinister. The disappearances had stopped, but not because the threat had been eradicated. Rather, it seemed the town had learned to ignore the creeping fear that had settled in its bones. The people who had lived through those years had either left or grown silent, leaving behind only whispers of a pact made long ago, a pact with the very thing that had claimed the lives of those lost to the lake. The second file was even more chilling. It detailed the history of the land itself, the lake, its formation, and its strange properties. It was not just a body of water, as the locals claimed. It was a place of power, a reservoir of energy that seemed to draw the darkness closer with every passing year. The first settlers had believed that the lake was cursed, but they had been drawn to it anyway, enticed by something they could not understand. They had built the town around the lake, ignorant of the forces they were tampering with. And now, the town had become a part of the curse, a vessel that allowed the darkness to remain hidden, kept in check by the unspoken agreements of the people who lived there. The third file had been the most disturbing, a series of letters from a man named Isaac Cray, a former town historian. His handwriting, frantic and uneven, revealed that he had discovered something buried beneath the lake. He had begun digging into the past of the town, uncovering fragments of an ancient ritual that had been performed at the lake centuries ago. The ritual, according to Cray's research, had been intended to bind a dark entity to the land, to keep it contained. But something had gone wrong. The entity had been awakened, and the town had paid the price for trying to control it. Cray's letters ended abruptly, with no explanation as to his fate. It was clear that he had been silenced, likely by those who had wanted the town's dark history to stay buried. As Ellie and Clara sat in the dim light of their cabin, the weight of their findings settled over them. They had come to the town looking for answers, but they had found only more questions. The history of the lake, the disappearances, and the townspeople's strange behavior. All of it pointed to a single truth. There was something lurking beneath the surface, something far darker than they could have imagined. But what was it, and why had it been allowed to continue for so long? Ellie's mind whirred with possibilities, each one darker than the last. There had to be a way to stop it, a way to break the cycle that had plagued the town for generations. But how could they fight something so ancient, so powerful? Clara, on the other hand, was more focused on finding out who in the town had known about these events and why they had allowed the curse to persist. She wasn't just looking for answers about the lake anymore. She was looking for the people responsible for keeping the town trapped in its grip. "We need to confront the town's leaders," Clara said suddenly, her voice sharp with resolve. "Someone in this town knows more than they're letting on. They've been keeping secrets for years, and it's time we found out who's behind it all." Ellie looked at her friend, unsure. Confronting the town's leaders could be dangerous. If they were truly involved in keeping the curse alive, they wouldn't take kindly to outsiders poking around in their affairs. But Clara's determination was infectious. She had always been the brave one, the one who wasn't afraid to ask the hard questions. Ellie admired that about her, but this was different. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about survival. "We need to be careful," Ellie warned. "If we go after them, we need to have proof. We can't just walk in there and start accusing people. The last thing we want is to become part of the town's history, like all the others who have vanished." Clara nodded, her expression darkening. "I know, but we can't just keep running. We've already uncovered too much. It's time to finish this, Ellie." The decision had been made, though neither of them said it out loud. They would confront the town's leaders, find out what they were hiding, and expose the truth. But there was a part of Ellie that feared what they might find. What if the truth was worse than anything they could imagine? What if the town's leaders were not just complicit in the curse, but actively working with it, feeding the darkness to keep their power intact? The thought made her stomach churn, but there was no turning back now. Whatever it was that haunted the lake, whatever ancient evil had taken root in this place, it would not be allowed to continue. Not if they had anything to say about it. The rest of the day passed in a blur as they prepared for the confrontation. They spent hours going over the records, trying to piece together the missing details, looking for any shred of evidence that would link the town's leaders to the dark force at the lake. They knew the risks, but the more they learned, the more they understood that the only way to end this was to expose the truth, even if it meant facing something far worse than they could ever have imagined. The town's forgotten past was not something that could be ignored. It was a part of them now, a curse that had been passed down through generations. And Ellie and Clara would not rest until they had broken the chain. As Ellie and Clara approached the center of town, their nerves were taut with anticipation. They had spent the night mapping out their next steps, analyzing the documents they had discovered and the letters they had read. The town's leaders were their only remaining obstacle, the final puzzle piece to understand the horrific truth behind the lake's curse. But with each passing moment, a gnawing sense of dread grew within them. Confronting the people in power wasn't just a matter of getting answers. It was about surviving the revelation of what had been hidden from the rest of the world. The town square was quiet, the usual buzz of local activity absent. It was as though the streets themselves knew something was about to happen, holding their breath as if waiting for a storm to break. Ellie glanced at Clara, who was resolute, her expression hard. She had always been the more determined of the two, but today, even Clara seemed unsure. What if their confrontation didn't go as planned? What if they were walking directly into a trap? "We need to find the mayor," Clara said, her voice steady but low. "If anyone knows how deep this runs, it's him." Ellie nodded, but there was hesitation in her movements. The mayor was the key to everything. That much was clear. He had been in charge of the town for years, long enough to have witnessed the strange events, the disappearances, and perhaps even been complicit in covering it all up. But the fear was real. No matter how much they had learned, they had no idea what kind of power the mayor wielded or how far-reaching the town's influence truly was. The mayor's office was located in a nondescript building near the town hall. It was small and unassuming, fitting in perfectly with the rest of the town's old-world charm. The door was open, a sign that the mayor was likely in. Ellie and Clara exchanged a look before stepping inside, the air in the room heavy with anticipation. The mayor, a man named Gregor Langford, sat behind a large wooden desk, his piercing blue eyes locked on them as they entered. He didn't look surprised to see them. In fact, he seemed almost expectant. "Ellie, Clara," Mayor Langford greeted them calmly, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. "What brings you here today?" Ellie swallowed hard. This was the moment they had been preparing for, and yet, the words felt stuck in her throat. How did they even begin to explain what they had uncovered? How could they accuse the town's leader of something so dark without sounding like they were losing their minds? "We know about the lake," Clara began, her voice firm despite the uncertainty in her eyes. "We know about the history of this town, the disappearances, the strange occurrences, everything. It's not a coincidence. There's something here that's been hidden for too long, and we're not leaving until we have answers." The mayor's expression remained unchanged, but Ellie could sense a shift in the room, a subtle tension in the air that hadn't been there before. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. "You've been poking around where you shouldn't," Mayor Langford said, his tone no longer friendly. "Some things are better left forgotten. This town has its ways, and those ways have kept us safe for generations." Clara took a step forward, undeterred. "Safe? You call this safe? People have disappeared, and you've kept quiet about it. There's something darker at play here, something that's been controlling this town, and you've been part of it." Ellie felt her heart race as the mayor's face twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was colder than anything she had ever seen, an expression that seemed to radiate both malice and something far older, something far more dangerous. The atmosphere in the room seemed to darken, as if the walls themselves were closing in. "You think you understand?" Langford's voice grew low, almost a growl. You have no idea what you're dealing with. This town's existence is tied to the lake, to the entity that sleeps beneath it. We made a pact that has kept us safe, kept us protected from the outside world. But you've been meddling in things you can't even begin to comprehend. You've made a terrible mistake. Ellie could feel a cold sweat prickling at the back of her neck. The truth, the horrible truth, was right there in front of them. It wasn't just a curse. It was a bargain, a pact with something far more terrifying than they had ever imagined. The mayor wasn't just a figurehead. He was a guardian, a keeper of secrets that were never meant to be exposed. What do you mean by pact? Ellie asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. Who made it? And why? The mayor's lips curled into a thin, cruel smile. The founding families of this town, those who settled here long before you arrived, understood the power of the lake. They knew what lay beneath it, and they knew the price of keeping it at bay. But not all of them survived the deal. Some were lost to the depths. Others were consumed by it. And now, the cycle continues. We live, and we protect the town, in exchange for keeping the darkness contained. Clara's eyes widened as the full weight of the mayor's words hit her. This wasn't just about one or two disappearances. It was about an entire community living in the shadow of an ancient evil, all for the sake of preserving the balance. The mayor wasn't merely protecting the town. He was part of the curse. Ellie took a step back, trying to process what had just been revealed. You've been sacrificing people, haven't you? That's why they disappear. The ones who vanish are the ones who have been chosen. Langford's smile faltered for a moment. Not chosen. Volunteered. His voice softened, but there was no warmth in it. This town, these people, they've all given something of themselves to ensure that the entity stays dormant. The balance must be kept. You've come here, seeking answers, but now you understand what happens when the balance is disrupted. You have two choices: leave and forget, or stay and join the pact. Ellie felt her blood run cold. The mayor was offering them an ultimatum: leave or become part of the town's twisted legacy. The choice seemed simple, yet the consequences were unfathomable. She glanced at Clara, whose eyes burned with a mixture of fury and fear. Neither of them could turn back now. They had already gone too far, learned too much. What happens to those who refuse the pact? Clara asked, her voice shaking slightly but still firm. Langford's smile returned, but it was darker, more menacing. You don't want to find out, he said, his tone heavy with finality. You've seen enough. Now, you must decide. The room fell into an eerie silence as Ellie and Clara processed the weight of what they had uncovered. The mayor had made his intentions clear, but in that moment, as the door creaked open behind them, neither of them could have anticipated what would happen next. The door to the mayor's office creaked open, cutting through the tense silence that had settled over the room. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as she instinctively turned toward the source of the noise. A figure stepped into the doorway, a tall, imposing man with sharp features and an air of authority that matched the mayor's. Behind him, several other townspeople filed in, their faces grim, their eyes focused, not on the two intruders, but on the mayor himself. Ellie and Clara exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes. This was not a coincidence. They were surrounded, and the mayor's invitation to join the pact was no longer just a simple offer. It was a warning. They were trapped, and with each passing second, the walls seemed to close in. It was clear that whatever power the mayor and these townsfolk wielded was much stronger than they had anticipated. "Ah, you've met the mayor," the new arrival said, his voice smooth and cold. "But I don't think you've met the rest of us. We're the town's true protectors, the ones who ensure that the pact remains intact. The mayor is just a figurehead. The real power lies with those who have kept the secret for generations." Ellie's mind raced as she took in the scene. She knew they were facing something much darker than a mere cover-up of a few disappearances. This wasn't just about one man's greed or a small group of elites conspiring for their own gain. This was an organized, deliberate effort to maintain a balance with something ancient, something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Clara, however, was no longer willing to back down. "What is it that you want from us?" she demanded, her voice trembling but strong. "Why are you trying to force us into this pact?" What exactly are we supposed to give? The man who had entered first, the one who seemed to be the leader of the group, gave a small, humorless smile. It's not about what we want from you, he replied. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to ensure the town's survival. The pact isn't just a bargain, it's a necessity. Without it, the very fabric of this place would unravel. You've seen the lake, haven't you? Felt the pull of its power? There is no escape from it once it has chosen you. Ellie could feel the weight of the man's words settle heavily in the pit of her stomach. The lake, the entity beneath it, had already claimed so many lives, and now it seemed that they were expected to join the ranks of those who kept the secret, perpetuating the curse for future generations. There was no question of leaving. Once you knew the truth, there was no turning back. You were either part of the town's twisted legacy, or you were a threat to it. The town's existence is built on this, the mayor interjected, his voice cold and calculated. Our prosperity, our safety, everything has been given in exchange for the entity's continued dormancy. It is the price we pay, and if you do not join us, the consequences will be dire. Ellie could feel her resolve beginning to waver. The enormity of what they were being asked to do weighed on her like a physical burden. Could she accept this? Could she accept that the town's survival was built on such a dark and twisted foundation? Was she willing to carry the same curse that had haunted this place for so long? But Clara didn't hesitate. No, we're not joining your pact, she declared, her voice filled with defiance. We came here to uncover the truth, not to become complicit in your lies. The man's smile faded, his eyes hardening. You think it's that simple? He spat. You think you can just walk away after learning what you've learned? There's no escaping this. You've already made your choice by digging too deep. Ellie's stomach churned as she realized what they had truly uncovered. The mayor, the townspeople, they weren't just members of some shadowy cult. They were the keepers of an ancient agreement. An agreement to appease an entity that demanded constant sacrifices, a force so powerful that it could not be ignored. Their lives had been defined by this pact, and now, Ellie and Clara were being forced to make the same choice. Join or perish. What happens to those who refuse? Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had to know. She had to understand the consequences of defying this twisted order. The man's face twisted into a sneer. The same thing that happens to anyone who defies the pact, he said, his voice laced with malice. You become part of the sacrifice. The entity doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. Ellie and Clara stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in like a heavy stone. They were being asked to make a decision that would determine the rest of their lives. Accept the pact and live under the shadow of the entity forever, or refuse and face a fate worse than death. The choice seemed impossible. Neither of them could fathom living under such a burden, but neither could they imagine what it would mean to fight against it. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The door to the mayor's office slammed shut, and the temperature dropped sharply. A cold wind rushed through the cracks in the walls, sending shivers down Ellie's spine. The air was thick with an unnatural energy, and as she glanced around, she saw the townspeople begin to move. Their faces had changed. Where once there had been cold determination, there was now something darker, something more sinister. Ellie and Clara took a step back, their eyes wide in horror. The group had circled them, and the mayor had risen from his chair, his expression unreadable. You had your chance, he said, his voice now low and threatening. Now you will see what happens to those who challenge the pact. Before either of them could react, a piercing, guttural sound echoed through the room, as if something deep within the earth was calling out. The walls trembled, and for a moment, Ellie thought she could hear the whispers of the entity itself, its presence vibrating through the very fabric of the room. The town, the mayor, the pact, it was all connected. And in that moment, Ellie realized that there was no escape. The only question now was whether they would become part of the town's cursed legacy, or if they would become its latest victims. The oppressive atmosphere in the mayor's office hung heavy, as if the very air around Ellie and Clara had become charged with something dark and ancient. The townspeople, now encircling them like a predatory pack, seemed to be waiting for something. The mayor, standing tall and unmoving, watched with a cold, calculated gaze. It was as if the room itself was alive with anticipation, with the creeping dread that something terrible was about to unfold. Ellie's pulse quickened, her body reacting to the undeniable tension in the room. As the sound of the earth's deep rumbling echoed once again, Ellie's mind reeled. The creature beneath the lake, the entity that demanded sacrifices. This was not just some local legend or mythical tale. It was a real, living force, one that held dominion over everything in this town, and those who remained inside its grip were bound to it. The reality of the situation was staggering. They were no longer just uncovering the truth. They were now a part of it, and they had little say in what would come next. Clara, standing next to Ellie, visibly stiffened, her body tense with a mixture of fear and resolve. It was clear she was no longer playing the role of a passive observer. There was a fire in her eyes, a determination to fight back, even if the odds seemed insurmountable. Ellie felt a surge of gratitude for her friend's strength, but she knew they were both in over their heads. The town's secrets were older than they had realized, and they were intertwined with the very fabric of this place in a way that left no room for escape. "You're trapped," the man who had spoken earlier said, his voice low but full of authority. "There is no running from the truth now. You've seen the lake. You've felt its pull, and you can't unsee what you now know. It is part of you, just as you are part of it." Ellie took a shaky breath, her mind scrambling for answers. There had to be a way out, there had to be. But in the face of so much history, so many lives lost to this cursed pact, it was hard to see the way forward. How could they fight something so deeply rooted in the land? How could they defeat a force that had held this town in its grip for generations? The mayor stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. His voice, though soft, carried a menacing weight. "The pact is older than your understanding of this place. You think you have uncovered it all, but you are merely scratching the surface. The entity beneath the lake feeds on more than just blood. It feeds on fear, on obedience, on the illusion of power. And you've been invited into this dance, whether you want to be or not." Ellie clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white as she struggled to maintain her composure. "We didn't ask for this," she said, her voice hoarse. "We didn't ask to be part of this nightmare. No one ever does," the mayor replied, his lips curling into something that resembled a smile but lacked any trace of warmth. "But you'll find that once you've tasted the truth, once you've seen what is really at stake, you have no choice. The pact isn't just a promise made to the entity, it's a chain. And you two are the latest links in that chain." Ellie's heart hammered in her chest. The mayor's words were like ice, and the chilling realization that they were now inextricably tied to the town's dark history threatened to break her resolve. But Clara, her voice steady and unwavering, spoke up again. "We may not have asked for this, but that doesn't mean we'll accept it. You've kept the truth hidden for generations, but we're not afraid of it. We'll fight." The room fell silent, the weight of Clara's defiance hanging in the air like a spark waiting to ignite. Ellie felt her pulse quicken. This was it. There was no turning back now. They had reached the point of no return, and if they were to survive, they would need to make a stand. The mayor's smile faded, and for a split second, Ellie saw a flicker of something darker in his eyes. "You misunderstand," he said, his voice lowering. "You don't have the luxury of fighting this. The entity doesn't care about your defiance. It will take what it wants, and you will either serve it willingly or be consumed." At that moment, Ellie felt a shift, something almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The temperature in the room dropped further, the air thick with a palpable sense of menace. The walls, once steady and solid, seemed to pulse with an unseen force. It was as if the entire room was drawing in a breath, preparing for something far worse than they could have imagined. Without warning, the ground beneath them trembled once again, stronger this time. The rumbling intensified, as though the very earth itself was protesting the defiance that had been spoken. The mayor's expression changed to one of grim satisfaction. "It has begun," he muttered. "The entity has chosen its course, and now there is no turning back." Ellie's breath hitched. The entity beneath the lake was no longer content to simply remain dormant. It was waking, and it was angry. The man who had first spoken, his eyes now glinting with something akin to reverence, stepped forward. "You have two choices now," he said. "Join us and become part of the town's legacy, or resist and face the consequences of invoking the wrath of what lies beneath." Clara's jaw tightened, her resolve unshaken. "We'll resist," she said, her voice clear and firm. "We won't be a part of this anymore." The man's lips twisted into a cold, mocking smile. "Then you'll see the true cost of defiance." In that moment, Ellie realized that what had started as a simple investigation into a string of disappearances had become a fight for their lives. The town, the mayor, the townspeople, they were all puppets of the entity beneath the lake, and now Ellie and Clara were being forced into the same twisted game. The only question that remained was how long they could survive in a town where resistance meant nothing, where the entity's hunger could never be truly sated. The real battle had only just begun. The following days after the mayor's ominous words felt like a blur to Ellie and Clara. The town, already suffused with dread, seemed to grow darker. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the streets, and even the sun appeared to hesitate in its course across the sky. The once bustling waterfront now felt eerily still. No one dared to speak of what had transpired in the mayor's office, but the tension was undeniable. The townspeople were no longer just watchful. They were waiting, anticipating something that would inevitably break. Ellie couldn't shake the weight of the mayor's warning. The entity beneath the lake was no longer just a ghost of legend or folklore. It was real, and it was awake. Her thoughts kept returning to that ancient, insidious presence, and she could feel it pressing against her chest, suffocating her. The idea of resisting, of taking on something so vast and malevolent, felt increasingly futile. But Clara, ever the optimist despite the overwhelming odds, refused to accept that they were without hope. "We've come this far, Ellie. We can't let fear take us now," Clara had said, her voice full of fire, though even she couldn't hide the tremor that slipped into her words. Ellie wanted to believe her, but the deeper they delved into the town's history, the clearer it became that no one had ever stood a chance against the entity. The people who had tried to break free had either vanished or been consumed by the lake's darkness. How could they possibly hope to succeed where others had failed? As night fell on the small town, Ellie and Clara sat in their cabin, the once comforting wood walls now feeling cold and oppressive. A low hum, almost like the sound of distant thunder, reverberated in the air, making the hairs on Ellie's neck stand on end. "It started," she murmured, her eyes scanning the darkness outside the window. The lake, which had once been a picturesque stretch of calm water, now looked ominous. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow that seemed to highlight the ripples in the water. Ellie felt a pull, a subtle, creeping sensation urging her to go closer, to stand at the edge of the water. She tried to shake it off, but it was there, gnawing at her, whispering in her ear. Clara must have felt it too, because she stood up abruptly, her hand gripping the edge of the table. "We have to stop this, Ellie. We can't just wait for it to take us. There's got to be something we could do." Ellie looked at her friend, her heart heavy with the weight of what Clara was asking. They had learned too much. The blood sacrifices, the pact that had kept the town tethered to the lake for generations, and the entity that had fed on fear and control. It was all too vast for them to comprehend, let alone fight. And yet, Clara's words resonated with a small spark of defiance. How could they not try? How could they just let it all consume them, as it had consumed so many before? With that thought, they made the decision to act. It wasn't about being brave or naive. It was about taking control of their fate, even if it was a slim chance. The townspeople had given themselves over to the entity's will for too long, but Ellie and Clara weren't bound by the same chains. Not yet. The town square was deserted when they ventured out, the only sounds the eerie rustling of the wind through the trees. They made their way to the edge of the lake, where the rippling water seemed to beckon them closer. As they approached, Ellie felt a familiar, tightening pressure in her chest. It was as if the lake was breathing, its currents alive with an energy she couldn't explain. Standing on the dock, Clara reached into her bag, pulling out the weathered book they had found in the mayor's study. It was covered in old symbols, ones they hadn't yet deciphered, but which they now believed held the key to understanding the entity. Ellie held her breath, watching as Clara opened the book to the last page, her fingers tracing over the ancient text. "I think we can stop it," Clara whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "We just need to understand the true nature of the pact. We need to reverse it." Ellie's stomach twisted. Reversing the pact? Could it even be done? The thought felt impossible, but the flicker of hope in Clara's eyes pushed her forward. They had come this far, there was no turning back now. But as Clara continued to read aloud, the lake seemed to react. The water churned violently, crashing against the shore. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel it. The lake was angry. They had stirred something far older and more dangerous than they could have imagined. The air grew thick, the oppressive feeling intensifying as if the very ground beneath them was about to give way. Suddenly, a deafening crack split the air, and the water surged upward in a monstrous wave. Ellie and Clara stumbled backward, nearly losing their footing as the wave seemed to tower over them. In that instant, Ellie saw it. Rising from the depths of the lake, a dark, formless shape, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly hunger. The entity had been awakened, and now it was coming for them. Ellie gasped, her breath caught in her throat. "Clara," she screamed, but the words barely made it past her lips. The creature was upon them, its form shifting in ways that defied logic, as if reality itself was bending around it. But Clara was already moving, pushing Ellie toward the edge of the dock. "We need to finish this," she yelled, her face a mask of determination. In that moment, Ellie understood. This wasn't just about survival. It was about breaking the curse, about freeing the town from its centuries-long shackles. The entity was powerful, but they had one weapon it didn't anticipate: their will to fight. As the water closed in around them, Ellie and Clara joined hands, chanting the words from the book, each syllable heavy with the weight of the truth they had uncovered. And then, just as the creature lunged toward them, a blinding light erupted from the water, and for a moment, everything went still. The battle was far from over. But in that one moment of defiance, Ellie and Clara had taken their first step toward breaking the entity's hold on the town, no matter the cost. The aftermath of the battle by the lake was nothing short of surreal. The once churning waters had stilled, the monstrous shape that had risen from the depths now absent. The oppressive weight that had hung over the town for so long seemed to lift, replaced by a haunting stillness that was both terrifying and relieving. Ellie and Clara stood at the edge of the dock, breathless, their minds struggling to process what had just occurred. The lake, which had been their enemy, now lay eerily calm, as if the very air had shifted in response to something immense and ancient finally being put to rest. But as Ellie looked out over the water, she felt a sinking sensation. The entity had not simply disappeared. It was gone, yes, but the cost of its defeat was something that couldn't be easily understood. There was a deep emptiness in the air, a lingering feeling that something irreplaceable had been lost, even if the town had been saved. Ellie wondered how long it would take for the residents to realize that they had been freed from the entity's grip, and whether they would even remember the horror that had once haunted them. Would they, too, feel the weight of what had happened? Or would they return to their lives as though nothing had changed? Clara turned to her, a tired but satisfied look in her eyes. "We did it," she said quietly, almost to herself. The words were simple, but they carried an enormous weight. They had gone up against something ancient, something terrifying, and had emerged victorious. The town would never be the same, but at least it would have a chance to rebuild itself. There was no denying that the entity's presence had shaped the town in ways they couldn't even begin to understand. But now, perhaps, they could start anew. Ellie nodded, but her mind was still racing. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. The lake was calm, yes, but what did that mean? Could something that had existed for centuries simply cease to be? Could the forces that had governed the town's fate for so long be undone with a few words spoken in defiance? The answer, as they would soon discover, was more complicated than either of them could have imagined. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and relief. The town was slow to wake from the grip of fear that had held it captive for generations. People began to go about their lives, as if the specter of the lake had never existed, as though the entity had been nothing more than a nightmare. But Ellie and Clara knew the truth. They had witnessed something impossible, something that defied everything they had ever believed. They had watched as the entity, the very essence of fear that had governed their lives, had risen up only to be defeated by their own defiance. But they also knew that the cost had been steep. In the quiet corners of the town, there were whispers, unsettling ones, that some parts of the town's history had been erased. The memories of those who had suffered under the lake's curse seemed to fade, replaced by a strange sense of calm. Yet Ellie and Clara felt a deep, gnawing feeling that something was wrong. The town's history was no longer theirs to remember. The people who had died, who had given themselves to the lake's hunger, were now lost in time, their stories untold. The town seemed to have forgotten them, as though the lake itself had stolen their memory. And then there were the dreams. At night, Ellie would wake to the sensation of something watching her. Sometimes, the whispers would come, a soft, unintelligible murmur that carried the unmistakable weight of a presence, lurking just out of sight. She would tell herself that it was just the after-effects of everything that had happened, that the fear had merely taken root in her mind. But it was harder to dismiss the feeling that the entity had not been entirely defeated. Perhaps it was never meant to be defeated. Perhaps it had only been pushed back, its form shifting and waiting for another chance to rise. In one particularly vivid dream, Ellie stood at the water's edge once again, staring into the depths of the lake. But this time, the water did not feel still. It rippled, undulating with an unseen force. And from beneath the surface, she felt the unmistakable presence of something ancient, something that was still there, watching her. The dreams were becoming more frequent, and Clara, too, had begun to experience the same sensations. Neither of them spoke of it openly, but they both understood. They had defied an entity that had lived for centuries, and now they were left to grapple with the consequences. The town had been freed, yes, but at what cost? What remained of the entity's power? What was left beneath the surface of that cursed lake? One night, unable to sleep, Ellie found herself standing at the edge of the dock once more, gazing out into the moonlit water. The lake was still, too still, and the weight of everything that had happened crashed down on her. She realized then that she was not just fighting a creature of darkness, but something far older, far more entrenched in the fabric of this place than anyone had known. The entity, as they had learned, was not just a physical presence. It was a force that fed on fear, that had become intertwined with the very history of the town. They had broken the chain, but had they severed the root? In that moment, Ellie understood that the entity was not a singular creature, but a manifestation of something much deeper, a reflection of the fear and the forgotten memories that had been buried in the town's past. It would never truly be gone. It would always be there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the next generation to stumble upon its horrors. The town, for all its newfound freedom, was never truly free from its past. It was merely waiting for the next chapter, for the next soul brave or foolish enough to challenge the darkness once again. Ellie and Clara had won their battle, but the war was far from over. As the first rays of dawn broke over the lake, Ellie turned away from the water. She knew that the town would go on, that life would resume its course. But she also knew that the entity, in some form or another, would always be watching, waiting. And so would she.